Hello and welcome to this edition of the Clean Energy Pod, powered by SSE, your guide to the people and technologies delivering the clean energy transition. In this edition, we talk to Michael Grubb, Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University College London. He's contributed to the UK's Climate Change Committee, as well as the UN's IPCC, and a whole host of other initiatives. So he's the right person to ask about climate change, the energy industry, and what needs to happen in the next few years. Let's get started. Michael and Alistair, thanks both very much for joining us. It's a good opportunity to talk about this because there's so much going on from a climate and energy perspective. Not only is this big problem that everybody's trying to deal with, but actually we're looking at governments in the UK and EU, and there's elections coming up, and there's a whole pile of things that could change in the next few months. So it's good to have a discussion about what the really big challenges are from an energy and climate change perspective. Michael, you're a professor of energy and climate change. Big job title. Just explain to those who are listening, what's the big problem we're all trying to solve here?
Well, the big problem is that we've known for decades that pretty much every tonne of carbon dioxide emitted in the atmosphere traps heat, makes the surface warmer, drives climate change, and we are seeing more and more of the consequences. So governments have agreed to get emissions down. They have to. You've got to get it to pretty much net zero in order to stop global warming and climate change. That, in a nutshell, is the big challenge, because historically we've had economies based on fossil fuels, which are carbon that we burn to get energy. So we need a whole new energy economy. And
as I understand it, the Paris Agreement talked about, emissions peaking in like 2025 or something in order to have a chance of hitting the 1.5 degree target. Are we anywhere near that?
So the Paris Agreement had overall goal to get well below 2 degrees and strive towards 1.5. I think most experts reckon it's now getting almost too late to reach 1.5, but 2 degrees, well within reach to keep that well below, but we cannot mess around. And yes, global emissions would have to peak pretty much this decade and start declining sharply thereafter to stay in that agreed range.
So Paris is still within our sights?
Paris is within sights, absolutely. But obviously the more prevarication there is, the harder it gets. Year by year, you just make the problem harder because you emit more emissions. Emissions go up, you've got to go down more steeply.
And you talked about the fact that traditionally we relied on fossil fuels to provide our energy. Going forward, that can't be the case. We want to get net zero. So what's energy's role in this transition?
Well, energy is absolutely central. Energy accounts for roughly 2/3 or maybe a bit more of global emissions. Land use, including agriculture, contributes the rest and is pretty hard to monitor. But clearly there's no way you solve this problem without fundamental change in the energy sector. So that's the central issue, and that is comprised of coal, oil and gas. Their role in different sectors, and one by one they've got to be displaced by clean energy.
And is that happening?
It is happening. Many would say not nearly fast enough. There's quite a lot of evidence.
Are you one of those many?
I think it's not fast enough, but I'm also in the camp that it's not all doom and gloom. We have actually made a lot of progress over the last 10, 15 years. The limitation has been, it's been in technology innovation in particular areas. They're expanding exponentially, but, we all know when something grows, it looks small at first. We're just in that real takeoff phase for a lot of renewables, but it's still largely concentrated in a limited number of countries, particularly China, EU, US significantly. The global rollout has to accelerate hugely. And there's some sectors that are still very tough to deal with.
Who's doing this well?
So it depends on your measures, right? By some measures, China is doing both the worst and the best. And what I mean by that is it's such a vast country growing so fast. They're still building new coal power plants, although they've cancelled a lot of their plans. But they are really leading the world in both renewable energy and in electric vehicles, which are a crucial part of that. The Chinese investments are huge in this space. The EU, I think, has done pretty well overall. It's helped to lead the renewables revolution and has also got policy mechanisms which help to put a price on carbon emissions, which any decent economist is say exactly what we should be trying to do as part of the armory. US has struggled because it's been so much a victim of culture wars and political, yin-yang in the US. The Biden administration has basically taken the view that it can afford to pour a huge amount of money into clean energy, partly because they want to solve the problem, partly because they don't want to lose out to Chinese industrial dominance in the clean technologies of 21st century.
And we're recording this podcast here in central London. How's the UK doing?
So the UK is a really interesting country in this context. It has the headline numbers of emission reductions pretty much led the world. Its emissions have come down by half over the last few decades, and in the power sector by even more just over the last 10 to 15 years. A lot of the rest of the world has noticed, because it used to be said, it's really difficult, impossibly expensive. And to see a country doing that has really caught attention. So the UK has done very well. It's done particularly well in the power sector. Cynics might say that's relatively easy when you started with a totally coal-dominated power sector, but we had a lot of cheap gas. That helped. And then we had big breakthroughs in renewable energy around the 2010, 2012 area, which we've seen, the massive rollout of offshore wind. But yeah, the headline stats are the UK's done very well. It's been slower in some of the other stuff that needs to be done. Buildings insulation, Britain's notorious for its bad, leaky building stock.
Let me interrupt you very, very briefly. It's important with these podcasts that we hear from you as well. We're all learning in this clean energy transition. So please, if you can, click like, subscribe, and of course, leave your comments below. What does clean power mean? What does it look like?
So clean power should look like a system which is predominantly renewable energy and non-carbon emitting energy. Combined obviously with storage, which you fill up with clean power and discharge when the wind's not blowing. That would mean a lot of storage and a lot of sort of flexibility, as it's known in the trade, of consumers who can actually say, well, actually I can shift my demand a little bit here and there to help those fluctuations on the system. That's what a real clean power system would look like. I think we've lost too much time over the last couple of years, probably to achieve the Labour Party goal on that headline definition. We're going to still need some gas, at least as backup on the system, in my view, in 2030. So, clarity around exactly what that target means, but it certainly means now, getting back on the acceleration foot, if I can put it that way, on renewable energy rollout and all the things that need to go along with that.
What are the other big buckets of flexibility that we need that we don't currently have? Because offshore wind seems to be going quite well. There are some big targets, but it seems to be going quite well. We're seeing solar and battery develop, but flexibility, as you say, is one of the missing bits of the jigsaw. What are the other big things we should be doing if we're going to have any chance of getting to these targets?
Well, first, I think it's useful when we talk about flexibility, it's a combination of storage at various stages in the system, including then end use of consumers who could either shift their demand or have local storage at once. Useful to break that and turn down to really short run storage, medium and then long run, because in the short run, really short run, like a few hours, batteries frankly are dominating. I mean, the breakthrough in batteries have been just as big as the breakthroughs in renewable energy. Perfectly feasible to have a few hours storage. Cost is manageable. Companies are already doing it. It's already become a mainstay of the power system in terms of really short-term reserve. Problem with batteries is the costs increase in direct proportion to the amount of storage. And that means they get really expensive if you're trying to get storage beyond a few hours. But we know our weather systems, have lulls of a few days and, demand goes up and down. So I'd also say in Britain, we obviously have a system which demand peaks in winter, but also wind energy is stronger in winter. We may have some need for interseasonal storage. It's very hard to see a business proposition, so that may be cast more as a sort of security issue where governments might want to invest, for example, in hydrogen caverns that can be called upon. I think the really interesting terrains is a few hours to maybe a couple of weeks. That's where you're talking about all sorts of different ideas on storage. Some think batteries could go there. debatable, or maybe not standard lithium ion, but other batteries, flow batteries. The chemists will talk about all sorts of battery configurations. The Chinese are doing a lot on compressed air energy storage. But we could spend a whole seminar on different storage technologies, and there's loads of innovation of ideas for storage. The question is, do we have enough incentives to get companies to really invest in those at the moment?
Just finish off on from a government incentive or a policymaker perspective, because here in the UK, there is a review of electricity markets at the moment. It's ongoing. What do you think that needs to do in order to fix some of the challenges that you've already identified?
So the REMA process...
What would a good REMA look like?
What does a good REMA look like? Well, the government has issued a second consultation on what it thinks a good REMA would look like. Personally, I'm a little bit worried that it's too much of an incremental approach that says these instruments we did 10 years ago worked really well, so let's have more of them. And I think it doesn't pay enough attention, ironically, to just how much progress we've made, but how that also changes the kind of problems we need to solve in the long run. So, for example, meeting the government targets on renewable energy rollout will mean that we potentially frequently have more coming, particularly if it's all concentrated on wind, more coming from wind actually than the system needs at a given point in time. So how do you design the contracts for that? And they've got some ideas which might involve sometimes, for example, paying generators not when they're not generating, but so that you have the investment security. But then you're going to have the kind of political backlash maybe that we saw about paying Scottish wind farms not to generate because the networks couldn't cope. And you still want companies to have that some incentive to invest in storage or in more diverse renewables. So that's not entirely straightforward to just say more of the same. It will need significant adaptation. Another area, I think, which does worry me, is the capacity market. I mean, I used to be deeply involved, and this is a market basically that's created that says, well, since renewables are variable, we also want to pay for stuff that we know is going to be available when it's needed. And so you basically sign a contract for which you get rewarded providing you're available when needed. Yeah.
It's an insurance policy, essentially.
It's kind of insurance. It's an energy security insurance policy, which is fine in principle. But the problem is now, again, that mechanism has worked. It's now got to the point where the price of that mechanism is relatively high, but it's paid to all generators that don't have renewable energy contracts. Most of those generators are gas, and including most of the established gas. So what that will do is basically give a substantial subsidy to all the gas generators and potentially new gas generators, which parts of the REMA analysis, I'm choosing my words carefully, parts of the REMA analysis suggest really will be needed. But it's subsidising all of them, which is going to depress the price of gas in the market, which will reduce the incentive for storage, because it will mean that you've got something which is very flexible, which has been directly subsidised through the capacity mechanism. So then you get, well, maybe we need to pay separately for some storage through the capacity mechanism. So you end up with really quite a complicated mix of stuff, a lot of which is government saying we better support this and we better create a special window for that and for this. So it does risk getting quite a complicated package. Having said which, if the answers were easy, then hopefully REMA would have, done some more imaginative changes to the framework.
Let me interrupt you very, very briefly. It's important with these podcasts that we hear from you as well. We're all learning in this clean energy transition. So please, if you can, click like, subscribe, and of course, leave your comments below.
Maybe to challenge you there, Michael, because I think kind of what you're describing there is maybe a kind of strategic reserve type model where you're basically providing capacity contracts for individual stations, like Germany's going for now. Right. But actually, is an argument to be made on the current design of the capacity market that ultimately, because it is market wide, it's been able to bring forward other forms of capacity that weren't kind of thought about when the capacity market was actually first introduced, and actually help reduce the kind of costs of the capacity mechanism today or the market today. So actually, in terms of storage, there's a lot of batteries in the system that have been kind of supported by the capacity market, lots of demand side response contracts. Actually capacity is a value in the electricity system that needs to be valued, and actually putting everything through the energy only model. Sorry to get into too much kind of rabbit holes of detail. Does that kind of rely on scarcity that investors can't really rely on, or scarcity pricing that investors can't really rely on, because ultimately policymakers will intervene, or actually, they'll intervene quite rightly, because you then get to a Texas type situation where when you really need it, that capacity is not there?
So, I think these are exactly the kind of debates we need. And I largely agree with you, Alistair. I think you've pinpointed, and I used to tell my colleagues I was involved in this stuff in debates and very much supported the capacity mechanism. I think we can kind of caricature that proposition, but rightly, as, if I said, well, think of building a power station, dear investor, but it's going to be for peaking needs only. And that means I'm going to be relying on very high prices, which occur very occasionally. And the investor says, well, how high and how often? I say, well, I don't really know. Chance of me getting a large investment, pretty limited, right? Mm-hmm. There's a limit to which markets will provide security. I think the great plus of the capacity mechanism is precisely what you said. It unearthed all kinds of stuff that we hadn't really thought about or expected. However, what I am saying is, if we're now moving into a phase of the transition where we've got much higher degree of renewables and variability, and we have, to be fair, both parties talking about getting to net zero in effectively a decade or less, we need to start thinking about what is the role of gas. And my worry is that with capacity market prices now a lot higher, the subsidy to gas plants is a lot bigger, all of them, and that will actually depress the wholesale prices fluctuations upon which storage relies. So, I'm not saying that I necessarily know or have the right answer, but one of them I think we should still consider is whether some plants should be moved into what's called a strategic reserve, which basically it's there when it's declared you really need it, but because it's being subsidized to continue operation, it's not going to just play in the market and outcompete newer and emerging ways of providing security. It's a contentious area. I acknowledge that. Not saying that's boilerplate either, but these are the kind of debates that we're going to have over the next years.
Yeah, and maybe add is actually, it's, obviously looking at from a kind of GB electricity market context, but these are very live discussions that are happening across the kind of, the European Union. So for example, when the kind of GB capacity market came in, there was lots of debate about the energy only market, and, Nordic markets were very, very keen to keep, energy only markets, and Germany was maybe a little bit in the middle. Whereas actually now we're seeing Germany moving towards, worlds where actually they're going to be putting in a capacity market. And so not only this question of what's your design of your capacity market within your own national market, how do these capacity markets interact between different countries and markets that are interconnected? This is exactly the sort of discussion that the review of electricity markets needs to be kind of thinking about. Not to say that the right answer is X or Y, but actually to get the hive mind of the energy world together to actually have these discussions and considerations. Yeah. And credit to the team at DESNZ, the UK Energy Department, in what they've done in the next steps. They've narrowed the options of which are under consideration, and admittedly some of them, I'm sure we'll probably come onto locational questions shortly, maybe not as much as we would have liked, but our collective understanding of the issues that a decarbonised, renewables-based electricity system will need to look like is much, much further forward than it was when they started the process 2 years ago.
Let's move on to that locational question then, because that is one of the other big things in the so-called REMA consultation. What we've been talking about already is a horrifically complex system with very complicated interactions. Then there's this proposal to move towards potentially more locational pricing. From your perspective, is that something that the government should be looking at, or should be focusing their priorities elsewhere?
So there's been a huge debate over recent years. I sometimes feel like I must be one of the few experts in the country that hasn't entirely landed where I think about the whole locational pricing issue. I think the government's consultation is very sensible in saying there's a couple of things we can take off the table and there's a couple of options we want on the table. They decided against what was called full locational marginal pricing, which is basically every node in the country might have a different price. So the options, but it acknowledges stuff has to be done about location, because it used to be a system where you had a sort of strong backbone grid and really big power plants would just feed power down the system to demand. End of story. And well, that's a simplification, but now we've got a lot of renewable energy in very diverse locations, a lot of power flows all over the system, going in different directions. We are much more aware of and concerned about constraints on the network, not matching up with where the generation is, or maybe sometimes not even where the big demand is or could be. And so something's got to be done about that. And the two options really are, can you tackle it through either investment incentives related to transmission? And transmission, the argument is, we already have some of this at the moment, right? Different regions have the same wholesale electricity price, but pay something different for the transmission to access it. So can you do it through that kind of charge based on the network per se, including maybe forward looking for investment? Or do you actually do it through the wholesale market itself, which says, well, it's actually more costly to sell power over here, so the electricity price should be higher over here, or likewise generation here. So that's the big debate. There's no question that a move to zonal pricing would be complicated, though not as complicated as locational. It does depend on how many different zones, what you have in the UK. REMA says nothing about what they have in mind there. You know, someone said it could be anywhere from 2 to 20 different pricing zones. I have spoken with some experts in the US. Their reaction tends to be, yeah, the transition's difficult, but nobody in the US would go where they have zonal pricing. They wouldn't go back to it. But it does throw up challenge. And the big risk is if it introduces big uncertainties for investors just when we need maximal investment. So I think that's what you're going to see. The other thing that will crop up is the politics. Energy prices are sensitive. Which government, if any, would bite the bullet of saying, actually, prices over there will be higher and prices over there will be lower, because that's what the underlying economics demands. And that's not going to be an easy sell for politicians.
So in everything we've discussed so far, apart from at the very beginning, we talked about timescales and, there's a kind of budget for the world and we need to get on and do stuff if we have any chance of meeting these global targets. And there's a lot of debate about policy and a lot of debate about technology, but there is a clock ticking here, isn't there? So
yeah,
is time factored enough into this where, yes, there might be a kind of purist view. I'm sure lots of people on spreadsheets come up with lots of things, but we do need to get stuff built and the lights need to stay on. So if you have that purely practical mindset, then what is it that government really needs to tangibly do? And what is it that industry needs to really tangibly do to actually get stuff done on time?
Well, I think the government is doing at the moment the most urgent thing, which is continuing with the annual CFD auctions and the capacity market, because it's got to make sure the lights stay on, right? The whole thing's got to be on the basis that electricity remains secure. So those are the short-term things, and nothing that REMA itself will do will change the pace of the next couple of auctions. That's basically a budgetary decision by the government this year, next year. Question is, having embarked on, a major reform 10, 12 years ago that helped launch the pace of this whole transition, can the same instruments actually get you to net zero? So, my question is, actually, if we don't address these other and newer and more, newly pressing issues, like actually who should be paid what, when we've got more renewable energy than the system can absorb, we need answers to those questions. We're not going to accelerate the transition by ignoring those questions and saying, well, that's too complicated. We'll visit it another day. So I think there's some questions that are now staring us in the face that have to be answered actually to unlock a credible and stable investment pattern for the next 5-10 years.
Michael, maybe to kind of bring it to one of the particular things that you were focused on in the kind of the REMA debates, which is the kind of industrial competitiveness question. And I think that's very live from, focusing on, green kind of growth, etc. The US kind of taking a slightly different approach in how to supporting industry. But as you mentioned earlier in the kind of discussion, how does it kind of compete with China? Fundamentally Europe in the round is a kind of high cost energy region. And so how does it then focus on ensuring that it can leverage, clean, affordable, secure energy, in the shape of renewables and in the networks to connect it? How does market design or policy design help? How is it going to be able to help us ensure that Europe is a place where industry want to locate because they have access to that kind of clean, secure energy?
So I think there's few answers to that question. Obviously, exercises energy intensive industry in Europe a lot. One of the big things is we need to keep the cost of capital down because all the new energy sources are capital intensive but cost almost nothing to run. So in the long run, if we have a renewables-based system that has been well designed and funded at relatively low cost of capital, that should actually be pretty good for energy-intensive industry. We've had a number of energy-intensive industries talking to us about some of our proposals that would facilitate their access to renewable energy at cost, rather than going through the whole wholesale market where the prices are much more volatile and often set by gas. It's another story. That's not a proposal the government's pursued, particularly in the current REMA. But sooner or later, there's got to be a structure which gets a lot of renewable energy at a low cost of capital and with companies able to access that broadly on a sort of cost plus related basis. Personally, I think that the prospects are not bad. I mean, I think there's still a lot of scope for innovation, particularly in some of the floating offshore wind, but we've seen the cost of established offshore wind coming down a lot. We've still got a lot of potential for onshore renewables. Britain is a very windy island compared with some regions. We don't have the solar resource of the south, but on the whole, we're not badly placed to provide clean and cheap energy, providing we get the policy engineering right. There's one other thing I'd say about relation, particularly with the US. The US in some ways is a very blessed country. It's got masses of energy resources of all sorts. It's got masses of land, etc. But the confidence of industry does matter. It affects the cost of capital. And I think in Europe, it's actually, despite all of the uncertainties and all of the concerns of industry in some ways, the fact that across Europe, including the UK, we have a carbon price also gives companies more confidence to invest in low carbon stuff because they're not totally dependent upon the government subsidy alone or other support mechanism. And I had a chat with the company that's doing the Swedish zero carbon steel plant, and they said explicitly it wasn't just the direct supports for the technology investment. That helped to make it plausible. What made the board want to do it is they could see the future for low carbon steel in Europe because there's also the carbon price. And I think that also gives more confidence for low carbon electricity investments because they know that gas will get more expensive as the carbon price goes higher. So, I think if we do this sensibly, we can meet the needs of European industry because we'll have capital stock that costs very little to run. And that's, in the long run, got to be a good thing.
Let's skip forward. It's 2034, 10 years from now. Things have gone well. What does the world look like from an energy perspective?
So I think the biggest change, actually, would be we'd have dispensed with this whole debate about can we afford net zero. It's a dumb debate. We now know enough about technology and engineering to know, yes, absolutely, we can afford net zero. We're talking about two different types of energy system. One is fossil fuel dominated. The other is renewables dominated. What's the fossil fuel system done to our economies over the last 50 years? It's not a very pretty sight when you look at 3 episodes of energy crisis. Renewables are dispersed. You know much more reliable effectively in the sense of knowing that. And I think in 10 years' time, we'd say, well, that was a bit of a stupid debate. Actually, all we needed to do was really try. And we discovered that there's a hell of a lot we can do. I think the other big change, though, is it would require changes in also consumer life in some ways, which sort of sounds scary and politicians hate to say it. But I've got an electric vehicle. It's great. I love it, my Zoe, and our kid loves it because it doesn't smell, and he used to go feel sick in the car, and it's quiet, it's just a better vehicle to travel around in, frankly. Once you've got infrastructure sorted out, if you're going long distances, and that technology is there.
I'm just back from the Outdoor Hebrides with an EV.
Well,
perfectly well the entire week I was going to the Hebrides, being in the Hebrides. The worst case scenario I had to plug it in, and I had to have soup and a sandwich at a local cafe, and it was excellent.
Shocking.
It was really
shocking.
It was
exactly. So some of this
local economic benefits there.
Exactly. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
We've actually got a heat pump now, and it works fine. It's like, there's still cost issues around that. Flexibility. A lot of people are not used to the idea that energy may be more expensive at some times of the day than other parts of the day. And hey, maybe that's an opportunity for people. So I think all of those things will require slightly more conscious public, or at least suppliers who are savvy enough to make good offers that make good use of consumer flexibility. But I genuinely think the more I look at this, that in 10 to 15 years time, if we do this successfully, people will look back and think, well, what was all the fuss about?
Let me interrupt you very, very briefly. It's important with these podcasts that we hear from you as well. We're all learning in this clean energy transition. So please, if you can, click like, subscribe, and of course, leave your comments below. Do you agree, Alistair?
I'll take Michael's optimism, but I'll maybe reflect back on 10 years past, right? When I was first coming into the sector, looking at these questions, it always felt like it was going to be a cost. It was going to be a disruption. I mean, you look at offshore wind, you look at EVs, you look at, obviously linked to that, batteries. Things have moved forward, solar, for example. Things have moved quicker than had been expected to 10 years ago. There'll be things that go slower, and, there'll be a lot of noise about that. But actually in 10 years time, there'll be things that make the direction of travel and where we want to get to a little bit easier. And so I think in that sense, optimistic, but there's going to have to be a lot of hard work to get there. And, it's going to require industry, policymakers, academia, regulators, wider communities, all kind of pointing in the same direction to go, here's how we here's where we want to go. And here's where here's how we're going to get there, and what the kind of building blocks we actually need to put in place to help us do that.
I agree. But just because something may look good in 15 years' time does not make it easy. I totally agree. Actually, it's going to require a lot of work and a lot of coordination, a lot of consistency in policy making.
I would add as well, we are always in cycles, whether it's politics or investment or technology. The things will ebb and flow. And, we've come off a period of a lot of political ambition, a lot of boosterism on, the clean energy transition. But actually, if you're looking forward to 2025, at the end of the year, we've got COP30, we've got solar being deployed at an unprecedented scale across the world. There's it might feel slightly negative in kind of political noises at the moment, but in reality, I think the long-term trajectory towards, action on climate change is something that is consistent. And, as Michael said, it's, incumbent on all stakeholders in society and our role as industry in supporting, cost-effective policy decisions that, ultimately make people's lives better.
And actually, if you look at some of the research, there's remarkable consistency in terms of public support for doing something. And even, I know it's an election year, and so there'll be election political noise, but the underlying policies are not, are pretty well agreed in terms of what really needs to happen to decarbonize. So actually, maybe we're actually in quite a good place.
Yeah, we have to constantly work on that, right? We have to ensure that we bring communities with us. We need to make sure there's wider economic opportunities that are kind of realised. It's not a case of, we've agreed net zero, let's get it done. It's going to be constant work and constant engagement, and bringing, communities, state and wider stakeholders with us.
Totally agreed.
Before we go, one very quick request. We're all learning in this industry as we go along, and the more we can share knowledge, the faster we will deliver the clean energy transition. With that in mind, if you found value in this conversation, please give us a like, subscribe, or give us a comment below. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.